হুম। স্টার্ট হয়েছে। হ্যাঁ, তো উই আর লাইভ। আচ্ছা, এটা দেখা এখনো কি কেউ এসেছেন? একটু একটু যদি কেউ বলেন, আমরা তাহলে লাইভটা স্টার্ট করব। আমরা কেউ যদি এসে থাকেন তাহলে একটু হ্যাঁ, এসেছেন, 4-5 জন এসেছেন। আমরা কি স্যার 5 মিনিট একটু ওয়েট করব? আর একটু লোক হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, তাহলে এখন 6টা বাজে, আমরা ঠিক 6:05 তাহলে ইয়ে করে দিচ্ছি। এসে গেছে
লোকজন বলেছে আসবে, তো
ঠিক আছে স্যার। হ্যাঁ স্যার,
বৈভব আপনাকে ফোন করে তোমাদের সঙ্গে কথা বলেছিল ওটা। যাই হোক, এসে যাবে ওরা। ঠিক আছে,
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ
ঠিক আছে, তাহলে 5 মিনিট জয়েন করে। ঠিক আছে।
হ্যাঁ স্যার, আর একটা হচ্ছে যে
বল। হ্যাঁ বল।
আরেকটা হচ্ছে স্যার, আমি আমাদের পেজের লিঙ্কটাও আমি আপনাকে ইমেল করে দিচ্ছি। জাস্ট ওই পেজটাতে ঢুকলে ওনারা ডিরেক্টলি শুনতে পাবেন। আমি পেজের লিঙ্কটাও শেয়ার করে দিয়েছি আপনার মেলে। আমাদের ফেসবুক পেজ।
ঠিক আছে, ভালো করেছো। তো আমার পক্ষে এখন আর কারোর সঙ্গে কিছু শেয়ার টেয়ার করা সম্ভব নয়।
ঠিক আছে স্যার।
হ্যাঁ, তো ঠিক আছে, থ্যাংক ইউ। হয়েছে, ওটা হয়েছে। থ্যাংক ইউ।
ওকে ওকে, থ্যাংক ইউ স্যার, থ্যাংক ইউ।
তাহলে আমরা 5 মিনিট শুরু করি। 5 মিনিট।
হ্যাঁ, একদম একদম একদম। হ্যাঁ, বেশ কিছুজন এসছেন, 10 এখন আর 3 মিনিট বাকি। তাহলে কতজন আছে বুঝতে পারছি না। আচ্ছা, হ্যাঁ আছে, ওকে। আচ্ছা, তার আগে কিছু কথা বলে নেওয়া একটু ভালো। সেটা হচ্ছে প্রফেসর সৌম্যব্রত চৌধুরী, উনি জওয়াহরলাল নেহরু বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ের আর্টস অ্যান্ড অ্যাস্থেটিক্সের প্রফেসর। এটা আমরা খুব সৌভাগ্যবান যে স্যার রাজি হয়েছেন এবং উনি বলবেন আজকে গান্ধী অ্যান্ড আম্বেদকর ডিবেটের ওপর। ওনার বেশ কিছু কাজ রয়েছে, যেমন আম্বেদকর অ্যান্ড আদার ইমর্টালস, যেটা নবায়ন প্রেস থেকে প্রকাশিত হয়েছে। ওয়েট অফ ভায়োলেন্স, তারপর থিয়েটার নাম্বার অ্যান্ড ইভেন্ট, 3 studies on the relationship between sovereignty, power and truth. Will the presentation be in Bengali? The presentation will be mostly in English. He will start with Bangla, but later on, the whole presentation will be in English. And there will also be a question answer session that will also be in English. And after the lecture is over, this video will be posted in our Facebook page, and we have decided that we will upload the video in our YouTube channel. So yes, it will be in English. So I think now we should start the live. স্যার, তাহলে আমরা শুরু করে দিই। আপনার মাইকটা বোধহয় মিউট করা আছে স্যার, আপনার মাইকটা বোধহয় মিউট করা আছে। আমরা তাহলে স্যার
এইবার
পারফেক্ট,
এবার শুনতে পাচ্ছ?
একদম পরিষ্কার, পারফেক্ট।
হ্যাঁ
হ্যাঁ স্যার,
বেশ বেশ
আমরা
ঠিক
আমরা তাহলে স্যার
তাহলে
শুরু করে দিই।
নিশ্চয়ই নিশ্চয়ই। তুমি শুরু করবে তো? তুমি বলবে প্রথমে তো কিছু একটা?
হ্যাঁ স্যার, আমি
কিভাবে করবে?
ওই আপনি যে সময়টা জাস্ট উঠলে আমি সেটা বলে দিয়েছি, যেমন কয়েকবার জিজ্ঞাসা ছিল, আমি একবার বলে দিয়েছি যে yes, the presentation will be in English and there will be a question answer session, and that will also be in both Bangla and English as well. And some of you have asked me that whether this video will be available in YouTube, or yes, definitely. We have decided that after the lecture is over, we will download it and we will upload it in our YouTube channel. And this video will also be available will be posted in our Facebook page. So after the lecture, questions are most welcome. So over to you, sir. Thank you, sir.
থ্যাংক ইউ থ্যাংক ইউ। তো বাংলায় শুরু করছি। আমি
স্যার
শুরু করছি বাংলায়। মানে প্রথমে বলি যে নবনীলকে বিশেষ করে এবং অন্য যারা এই পাঠ্যচক্রের আয়োজক উদ্যোক্তা, তাদের প্রতি আমি খুবই কৃতজ্ঞ। এই সুযোগে কিছু কথা আপনাদের সঙ্গে আমি আলোচনা করব আজকে। কিছু জানা কথা, বেশিরভাগই জানা কথা, দু একটা নতুন অন্তত আমার তরফ থেকে নতুন বক্তব্য আমি চেষ্টা করি আপনাদের সঙ্গে যদি সেটা কিছুটা ভাগাভাগি করা যায়। কিন্তু যেরকম বললো, এই যে নবনীল বললো যে মূল যে লেকচারটা হবে, টকটি, সেটা ইংরেজিতে হবে। আর তারপরে যদি কেউ বাংলায় আমার সঙ্গে কোনো কিছু নিয়ে আলোচনা করতে চান বা প্রশ্ন থাকে, তাহলে আমি স্বচ্ছন্দে বাংলায় তার সঙ্গে কথা বলতে রাজি আছি, সেটা ঠিক আছে। তবে বেশিরভাগটাই আমি ইংরেজিতেই বলবো। তো এইটুকু বলে আমি শুরু করি ইংরেজিতে। So I was told, though I'm not on the social media, but I was told that this talk was announced as a talk on the Ambedkar-Gandhi debate. So that is correct. It is on the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate, to the extent that that debate forms the point of departure for whatever I'm going to talk to you about. But then the so-called Gandhi-Ambedkar debate is a very historically and also in terms of its substance, a very long-drawn affair, and with a lot of dimensions, much of which has been written about comprehensively, and both in terms of the documentation, also in terms of the different interpretations. There has been so much literature produced and of a very high order on the debate that I do not think I want to simply go over or repeat or rehearse that literature today. In any case, that will take a long time. What I want to do today is to actually take some very marginal material from that debate and develop it in a somewhat different direction. You could call it a speculative direction, but a speculative direction, first of all, in relation to something which we associate with Gandhi in particular as a very central tenet of his life and work, which is nonviolence. So something to do with some speculations, some thoughts on nonviolence, but in relation not only to the Ambedkar-Gandhi debate, but also to someone who is a somewhat improbable figure in this constellation, and that is Simone Weil, a French thinker, and actually an activist who was involved in a lot of labor organization work, labor activism at a certain time, but also a unique singular thinker who had something to say about nonviolence, and also who at a certain point in her very short life, she died at a very young age, in her 30s, I think, or maybe in her late 20s, I'm not entirely sure, but very young, who in that brief period, duration of her life, actually had some things to say about such well-known Indian texts like the Bhagavad Gita also had a very specific question for Gandhi in her notebooks. So I am going to refer to that as part of the overall arrangement that I'm going to make of these materials. The main chunk of that material, of course, indeed does come from the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate in the first phase of that debate. So first, let us be very clear and let us simply schematize for ourselves the different historically, but also in terms of the themes, the different moments of the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate. The very question of what a debate is itself, I think, an extremely interesting and pertinent question here. And at some level, everything that we are going to talk about today will also address the very genre or the form of what retrospectively became so well known as a debate. But what is a debate is not something which is self-evident. But I'm not going to talk about that separately, because that's an issue of something like the discourse of debate and the rhetoric of debate as a separate debate. So I'm not going to talk about that, but the implications for those questions, for those discussions, are definitely there in what I'm going to say. So first of all, how does one look at the so-called Gandhi-Ambedkar debate in its historical unfolding, and which are the moments? So probably one could think of three such moments for the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate. The first one is the largest portion of that debate from 1930 to 1932, which is during the roundtable conferences, and following which the well-known, famous fast unto death that Gandhi went on in the Yaravara prison in Pune, with regard to the issue of the debate, if you will, of separate electorates. That's the first moment of the debate. The second installment of the debate actually emerges with the publication of Ambedkar's speech, which was not ever made, a speech which was never made, but which got published as a text, which is Annihilation of Caste, in 1936. And after that publication, Gandhi wrote a review, a kind of refutation of the thesis, mainly contained in the Annihilation of Caste, the main thesis contained in the Annihilation of Caste, to which again Ambedkar wrote a kind of repartee or a kind of retort. So between the original text, Gandhi's review, and Ambedkar's retort to that review, the second phase of the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate could be placed. So that's the second phase. Now, in the third phase, it's not a phase at all, which is in the 1940s up to, well, at least Gandhi's the independence of India, and then Gandhi's assassination. In that period, Ambedkar wrote about Gandhi not only in terms of very specific issues like the separate electorate, or on the occasion of the publication of a text like the Annihilation of Caste, but in terms of a more systematic, even an ideological critique of Gandhi that you find in his 1945 text, what Congress and Gandhi did to the untouchables. And that critique is a critique of what Ambedkar calls Gandhiism. So that would constitute the kind of third part of this history of what happened between Ambedkar and Gandhi. Of course, after Gandhi was killed, towards the end of Ambedkar's own life in the 1950s, after his tenure as a law minister, he gave a long interview to BBC, and in that interview, he actually recalled the early days of his confrontation, and that was a confrontation, if ever there was a confrontation with Gandhi, on the question of the separate electorates after the roundtable, or during and after the roundtable conferences. And Ambedkar recalled that with great vitriol, with a certain verdict that Gandhi was definitely not a Mahatma for Ambedkar, in the light of Ambedkar's experience with Gandhi, particularly in that phase. But it's interesting that on this very epithet, of this very title of Mahatma, Ambedkar, when he would refer to Gandhi in his more theoretical or more intellectual differences, or his intellectual polemic against Gandhi, he would use the word Mahatma in a sarcastic way, in an ironic way, and at certain crucial moments of how the debate developed in terms of the argumentation on both sides, Ambedkar would say that whatever else he is doing, the Mahatma is not thinking. So if he is a Mahatma, he is not thinking. And if he is thinking in his typical strategic way in specific situations of history, then he is not a Mahatma. This, by and large, was Ambedkar's all-rounded, or the summary of Ambedkar's experience with Gandhi. And in a way, this term Mahatma does play a very interesting, elusive role, or ironic role in the way Ambedkar looks at Gandhi or thinks about Gandhi, both in the present of certain moments when he's confronting Gandhi on issues, but also retrospectively after Gandhi is killed and Ambedkar is thinking about what happened in the past. And that material is found in the BBC interview that he gave. So that's the first introductory sort of factual, schematization that I thought would be useful to keep things in perspective for us. Now the second part is really something very particular, so particular that it might not have any significance in the larger scheme of things. Nevertheless, that's what I'm going to take up. And it's from the early part of the debate during the Roundtable Conference in Great Britain, in London. And after that, once the two of them come back to India, what happens? This is happening in 1931 and 1932. It's in this period. Now, I'm being able to speak of all this because of a book that has come out just a few years back, maybe 3 years back, which I was fortunate to read, and which has actually given me a very clear and vivid sort of almost a theatrical picture of what went on there at that time between Gandhi and Ambedkar. And that book is by Raja Wundru, many of you know about it, which is a book on the India's electoral system with three main figures that he studies: Ambedkar, Gandhi, and Sardar Patel. But what he does is that he actually takes the archive of that period and condenses it, and also makes it very simply accessible to the reader in terms of the chronology of the events at that time. A lot of citations from the actual press conferences or the public speeches that Gandhi more, but also Ambedkar made. Also, very interestingly, and that is where the dramatic sort of picture emerges more graphically, during Gandhi's Pune fast, after which the so-called Pune Pact happens, over 7 days, 6 days or so, 19 September 1932 to around 26 September 1932, during which time Gandhi is on fast in prison, in Yarawara prison in Pune. And in that period, what happens? Literally day to day, a kind of account, a kind of diary is put out by Wundru. And that is fascinating. That is fascinating. And of course, one would want to know that, is this all Wundru's own sort of literally a kind of imagined, though of course very true to the reality, but nevertheless a kind of imagined scenario. But no, it is simplified and it's very nicely structured, but actually it is something that has come out of Mahadev Desai, particularly Mahadev Desai, very close associate of Gandhi and a kind of secretary. Mahadev Desai's accounts of what happened at that time, and also other people who were there, but particularly Mahadev Desai's accounts. Very, 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 very clear and very accurate. So actually what is going on is that we are seeing a set of what in the language of drama would be called dialogues, between Gandhi and Ambedkar, when Gandhi is in the prison, and occasionally, but regularly at the same time, because it's a moment of crisis, Ambedkar, along with his friends, his associates, visited Gandhi. And there were also some relatively neutral mediators at that time. So all of that is panning out. All of that is unfolding very, very interestingly in this book by Raja Bundru. So what I'm going to do now is actually take two fragments, very, very marginal to the actual debate. So please don't expect me to talk about the debate in terms of the real issues, which is what is the issue of separate electorates, and how does at the end of that confrontation and that breakdown of any kind of dialogue, the dialogue actually leads to a breakdown. We do come to a new reference point in the history of India's political and electoral system, which is the reference point of reservation, which we know, up to the present, we know it very well, what reservation is in politics. But actually it emerges as a kind of settlement, which is a pact, part of the Pune Pact. And it also happens in relation to other people who tried to negotiate or find a kind of compromise in view of the fact that Ambedkar was very firm, ideologically firm on his demand for separate electorates, and Gandhi was also very firm on absolutely not accepting separate electorates for the depressed classes, who were basically constituted of the untouchable, the castes which were considered untouchable, which is a kind of retrospectively criminalized, criminal qualification or disqualification of people who, in terms of a certain bureaucratic, neutralized language, would be called depressed classes. So the depressed classes, as eventually being given reservation in the electoral system, Indian electoral system, and not having the right to having separate electorates. Now, what separate electorates is something probably many of us know, and also it is a very complex question in terms of the actual procedures of what the separate electorates were supposed to be at that time. But I am not going to enter those discussions today, because that is not my main purpose. I'm going to talk about something which is to do with Gandhi's method of agitating, which is also called satyagraha, of course, but taken in its bare bones, in its actual, what it does materially, it is a fast, a hunger fast, a fast unto death. And that is exactly what Gandhi announces in 1932, once he comes back from England, Great Britain, after the Round Table Conference fails, breaks down, and from the side of the British the authorities and Ramsay MacDonald, who's the Prime Minister, Ambedkar has been, and the depressed classes have been granted separate electorates, while Ambedkar was the representative of the depressed classes. And Gandhi, at a later moment, and this is something Ambedkar keeps pointing out, that Gandhi seems to have thought about this towards the end of what happened. Initially, he was not so strongly inclined against it. He was, in fact, treating it as a minor matter, this issue of separate electorates for the depressed classes. But it's only towards the very end of the Round Table Conference, the second part of the Round Table Conference, that Gandhi suddenly becomes extremely recalcitrant and totally refuses to accept separate electorates for the depressed classes. And he speaks a lot about it. And this starts at the end of 1931, when they are still in England, and Gandhi actually addresses, and so in around, I think, September 1931, or October, no, in October 1931, Gandhi actually addresses a kind of Indian audience at Oxford. And there he refers to Ambedkar, and that is when Ambedkar is being referred to by Gandhi again and again, because it is clear that Gandhi realizes that Ambedkar is a he's young and a kind of intellectually animated, but by such force that he cannot be ignored, he cannot be neglected. And so it seems that Gandhi actually oscillates, or almost Gandhi's own reactions are polarized between two extremes. So on the one hand, in this very address in October 1931 at Oxford, Ambedkar says that, Gandhi says that Ambedkar is somebody who I have great regard for, and he's bitter because he has gone through, as part of his people, that is, people who have been treated as untouchables over such a long time, and he has become so bitter that I would think he has a right to, and this is Gandhi's exact words, as cited by Rajabandhu, he has a right to break our heads. Now, this metaphor of break our heads is something I would like to pay attention to and draw your attention towards. He says, if he does not break our heads, he does it out of self-restraint, because he has a right to break our heads. But at the same time, he says that Ambedkar, because he's bitter, has become unclear. His ideas are unclear, and his ideas are actually distorted. And he sees in every caste Hindu an enemy. He sees in every caste Hindu someone who is out to exploit and oppress the depressed classes, from which he wants to separate. So this is a very peculiar kind of a statement that Gandhi makes at that time. That on the one hand, he gives Ambedkar and his people the right to, in his metaphor, break our heads. Now, it is a metaphor. Of course, it is a metaphor. Nevertheless, the very nature of the metaphor, in terms of its graphic, violent meaning, its violent evocation, is something I think we cannot avoid reacting to or thinking about. And this is not the end of the matter. Later, when they come back to India, and after almost a year, when Gandhi actually writes a letter to the British authorities, the Prime Minister, and declares that he's going to go on a fast unto death until the separate electorates are withdrawn, the grant of separate electorates are withdrawn, the communal award, as it is called, is withdrawn. And then the negotiations start, or the visits start to the prison, because Gandhi has already been arrested once he got back in the context of the civil disobedience movement. Gandhi has been arrested. So at that time, Gandhi again says at a particular moment that Ambedkar has a right to spit on our faces. But as far as the question of the objective issue of communal award is concerned, separate electorates is concerned, Ambedkar has lost his way. Ambedkar is not thinking clearly. It is actually something which is so damaging for everyone concerned, for the depressed classes, for society, and eventually for the very principle of the matter, which is what? Which is representation in politics, the question of just, fair representation. In each of these dimensions, Gandhi's judgment is that Ambedkar has lost his way. And at every time he says these things, that he has a right to spit on our faces, he has a right to break our heads, and if he does not do it, we can only be grateful to his self-restraint. While he says all this, he is again making extremely harsh, critical judgments about Ambedkar's own judgment, Ambedkar's own analysis of the situation of the depressed classes in India, both over a long period of time, since untouchability is something which has been there for a very long time, but also in the specific context of the colonial government and its proposal towards a reform in the electoral system, both in the long perspective and also in the immediate context. So from both angles, Gandhi is saying that Ambedkar is not actually being able to analyze the situation correctly. And to make this point even more, to drive home this point with even greater force, when Gandhi realizes that actually Ambedkar has a lot of supporters, and he himself is a extremely, like I said, animated, powerful intellectual figure. Gandhi makes it personal. So the documents clearly show this. Gandhi makes it personal. And Gandhi says that Ambedkar might officially come as a representative of the depressed classes, and he himself is someone who belongs to the depressed classes. But actually, if you were to do a referendum on the question of who would represent on a kind of nationwide scale, on the total scale of the population of the depressed classes, Gandhi claims he would be the representative and not Ambedkar. So he makes it personal. No such referendum is, of course, happening. But Gandhi almost makes this boast, this kind of this bombastic claim that he would win over Ambedkar. Now, whether he would or not is not the point. But that, and the fact that Gandhi is a mythically popular leader even at that time is not something in dispute. Everyone would agree with that. But the point is that Gandhi otherwise is not usually seen as a boastful person at all. He's seen as a very clever person, as a tactical person, but not as a boastful person. But it is interesting that Ambedkar drives him to boasting in a kind of desperate attempt to win over the image or the building image and power of Ambedkar at that time. But this is not to say that Ambedkar does not realize Gandhi's own power. So actually, when he meets Gandhi in the prison, and Gandhi is getting more and more weak, and his body is breaking through the fast, and his life is in danger. Towards the end of that, or not towards the end, maybe in one of the early days from 19 September, maybe on the 20th or 21st, towards the early part of the fast, Ambedkar says very clearly to Gandhi that Gandhiji, you have been unfair to us. You have been unfair to us, to our people, to my people. But at the same time, Ambedkar says, in this dramatization by Wundru, that if you were to take up the cause of he doesn't say Harijan, Gandhi keeps saying Harijan, but of the depressed classes, then you would actually be a hero of the depressed classes. So Ambedkar actually says this. Now, of course, he says this also tactically, because he's also trying to reach out to Gandhi and make Gandhi somehow come to some point of agreement, given that it's a huge pressure on Ambedkar with Gandhi's life in danger. So he is obviously trying to reach out to Gandhi and asking Gandhi to bend a little bit on his refusal of the communal award. But he's doing it also through recognizing Gandhi's, like I said, immense, almost mythical popularity. And he says, if you were to, do what you're capable of doing, and only you are capable of doing for the depressed classes, then you would be their hero. But you're not. You're not doing it. And to that extent, you're being unfair. And of course, Gandhi replies with an intelligence and with a kind of exactness of the situation, which is so frustrating, but at the same time so effective from Gandhi's own point of view. When Gandhi says to Ambedkar that this is my misfortune, to be always unfair to everyone. So, this is something which, and he also says that, it's very sweet of you Dr. Ambedkar, to say that, to say such a nice thing that I would be a hero. But obviously I'm not changing my position. I'm not bending at all. So without going into the actual debate or the conflict on the issue of separate electorates and the question of what is at stake in that debate, which is the fairness of political representation with separate electorates as one paradigm and complete, the complete formal symmetry or equality between all the voters without any separation of electorates or even reservation, and the third paradigm of reservation. So that discussion is a separate one, and a lot of people have done it, and Gundru's own book is a fantastic site to carry out such discussion. But that is not what I want to analyze today. What I want to tell you is, or what I found, and something which you probably see very clearly by now, is that what effectively in this statement that Gandhi is making vis-a-vis Ambedkar, he's saying is that insofar as you're oppressed, and you are oppressed, you have a right to violence. Now, here violence would be, of course, a very, very, very contested idea. What does it mean to say violence? Spitting on you is a metaphor. Break your heads is a metaphor. So Gandhi is probably not saying that you have if you literally take up violence, that is something I would accept. But he is saying, and that is the main point, that it is not merely a metaphor. He's saying that you have a right to oppose your oppression at a level which is so forceful, which is so intense, with an immediacy, given the depth and duration of the oppression you have gone through, as being treated as untouchables, that is something I recognize and I accept. To that extent, if violence is understood not as the physical act of what could be called potentially a physical act trying to impose the law of death on bodies, which means that violence is something which eventually says that I have the right or I have the power to kill you, for whatever reason, in whatever circumstances. So Gandhi is not probably thinking of the law of death here, but he is thinking of something intermediate, which is the law of a kind of intense, forceful retort, a kind of reactive right that the oppressed have. The erstwhile, not the erstwhile, at that time they were treated as untouchables. It's erstwhile now, formally at least. But the depressed classes, to use the official language, the depressed classes do have a right of intensity. And intensity, in a sense, already demands at the level of language the analogy of a kind of violence. So not only is it a question of right, it is, and that is a key word here, it is natural. So such reaction is almost organically natural. It's a kind of organic right of reflex. It's a kind of reflex that as people who are always divided between their natural beings and their historical selves, their historical existence, divided between the two, they have a right to react to historical oppression with their natural reflex of hitting back or defending themselves. So you could also call this defensive violence. Though, of course, Gandhi does not at all formalize this in this context. He will do this kind of formalization, for instance, in the context of the violence that takes place on a global scale during the war, the Second World War. And what should be the policy with regard to the war as far as the British government is concerned? On those questions, Gandhi will talk about a kind of defensive violence, or even a moral violence when it comes to opposing something as monstrous as Hitler and Nazism. Now, that's not what he's doing with Ambedkar. The nature of the discourse is very subjective. He is using a metaphor, and all metaphors are used with subjective intentions to convey a point rhetorically, which he is doing. He's saying he has a right to spit on us. He has a right to hit us, to break our heads. But what it means, it seems to me, is that he has a right as an oppressed to react at the very level of that oppression, which is historical. All oppression is historical, in historical situations, in forms. And at the level of that form and situation, the oppressed have a right to react. And they will react. Not only that, do they have a right, whether they have a right or not depends on how you look at it, but they will. No one can change this. It's a kind of law of nature. There will be some kind of reaction, which will, violent or not, only violence can capture its image. The imaginary of such reaction is only violent, even if the actual physical reaction is not necessarily violent. So the intensity is violent. So that's the first proposition that I have, that Gandhi, in a way, reveals to us, or reveals to the future audiences of history, of posterity, a certain thinking of violence at an unconscious level through the use of metaphor. And here he seems to accept or even endorse the existence of violence as irreducible in both history and nature, not as something which you can simply wish away, or even condemn out of some sort of isolated moral superiority. Let's be grant this to Gandhi. He's not doing it. He's saying that the oppressed will react as a kind of natural materiality, or which is not different from historical materiality in the experience of the oppression. But immediately comes the second proposition, as inferred from what Gandhi says. And that is very clear. He says, precisely because they will react, and no one can change that, no one can stop it, they are themselves not in a good intellectual position to judge the actual historical relationship that causes oppression. This is his damning point. This is his sort of indirect condemnation of Ambedkar. Ambedkar, as an individual person, might be a peerless scholar, the greatest genius as far as intellectuality is concerned. But precisely because he's implicated in the historical structure of oppression, he is not in a good position to judge the nature of that oppression, or he is not in a good position to judge the way to combat that oppression over a long time. That is, in terms of strategic thinking, in terms of systematic thinking, in terms of politics, insofar as politics is something which must overcome nature, must go beyond nature. Again, Gandhi is not saying on any of this. It is all a kind of the unconscious of the discourse that we are bringing out. But I think that unconscious is a very powerful unconscious that is working with Gandhi. So before we come to Gandhi's conscious decision to take the path of nonviolence and make nonviolence into a strategic tool for political ends, like in this case, and there's so many other cases, but we are limiting ourselves to this case. We must, I think, be able to recognize the kind of unconscious that Gandhi's own discourse possesses. And that unconscious is interestingly and something that it's surprising that it's surprising. It's surprisingly something which does recognize the irreducibility of the materiality of violence in an unjust history. But at the same time, it is this very recognition which prevents Gandhi from granting the untouchable or the depressed classes, including the great exceptional figure of Ambedkar, which Gandhi recognizes to be exceptional, the status of a subject of history or a subject of politics. Because like any other, so to speak, rational being, and Gandhi is supremely rational, whatever post-colonial studies says, Gandhi does not grant Ambedkar this rationality of politics, which he himself claims for himself. And the reason for that is, it is precisely oppression that blinds us. The fact that we are oppressed blinds us to a clear analysis of what to do about it. Now, I cannot go into any lengths on this point, but it's a very important point in terms of political thought, because what it says is that all politics is politics of totality. Politics is never subjective. Politics is, it might require deep subjective commitment and courage. Gandhi has both of these things, no doubt. But it in itself is something objective. And so Gandhi again and again says that what Ambedkar is doing and what the others are doing is something which is looking at the entire question from their own point of view, which is totally justified in terms of their experience, the experience of endless oppression over such a long time, but which is not in itself the best tool to throw light on the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed in totality, which is equal to society. So in that sense, Gandhi is supremely rationalistic, even if he doesn't formalize it in the way rationalist philosophy does, political philosophy does. But he's supremely effectively rationalistic. That's why he keeps referring to Hindu society not as something either on the side of caste Hindus or on the side of the depressed classes, but as something which is a kind of ideal totality. And he says the ideal is something we must protect because it gives society a certain stability. And not just a stability, it gives society the potential of correcting its historical wrongs through something beyond history. Now, this is very interesting because what is beyond history in Hindu theology would be something Sanatan, immemorial, eternal. But this is where Gandhi's language is not philosophical at all, but practically extremely dense and at the same time very, very intelligent as kind of strategic intelligence. So Gandhi says, I am opposed to the Sanatanists. He says, I will completely break with the Sanatanists. And this is what he does at the level of projecting himself as a kind of existential, as an existential partisan of the untouchables by saying, so Gandhi is the one who refuses to take the word untouchable as criminal. You see, this is something shattering. Ambedkar is saying untouchability is criminal even before it has been criminalized by law. Because it is a social crime. It is a crime against humanity. But what is Gandhi saying? He is saying, but I am untouchable. He says, you are untouchable by being forced to be untouchables. I am an untouchable by choice. And he uses the brutal word, the obscene word of caste discourse. I am a Bhangi by choice. So he does not evidently see the generic logic of untouchability as criminal. He sees it peculiarly as internally you can emancipate it, internally redeemable. Now, of course, you cannot do it through the actual practice of untouchability. That is absurd. But you can do it, strangely, through kind of existential, subjective extraction of something which you can demonstrate through your own life. So you see, there is a major complication here. On the one hand, Gandhi is rationalistic. He is objective. He is talking of Hindu society as a totality to which you cannot simply take the rationally. Of course, in terms of your own experience, you will always be partisan. You will speak from the point of view of your own experience of oppression. But you cannot do it if your main aim is to ensure justice and fairness. You have to take the totality. But to take the totality as your object, you need to take a distance from that totality. You have to almost take a kind of Archimedean point. That would be, the final move of the Enlightenment kind of a framework of thinking, which very correctly the critics of that kind of Enlightenment colonial thinking have made. But Gandhi does not make that last move. At that last moment, instead of becoming a scientist of society, which is far closer to the Ambedkar of castes in India and so on and so forth, these texts of genius that he wrote, Gandhi says something really very difficult, something very difficult to rationally fathom. He says, I am the true untouchable. I am an untouchable by choice. I am against the Sanatanists. So objectively, he's talking of a Sanatan through a Sanatan logic, an immemorial logic. But subjectively, he's against the Sanatanists and is an untouchable, a Bhangi. Objectively, he's saying the practice of untouchability is evil. But subjectively, he's an untouchable. This is where Gandhi makes you really very bewildered. And he does bewilder everyone, including Ambedkar, towards the end of those conversations, because Ambedkar, to his own friends in a hotel in Pune, where they stayed during this last period, Ambedkar does say to his friends that I do not understand this man's mind. At some point, it is indeed a question of thinking. There is a kind of impasse either in that thinking or in Ambedkar's and in our understanding when we are confronted with the nature of that thinking, which is so polarized between extreme rational, strategic, targeting of what you have to reach through political aims on the one side, and on the other side, this kind of existential investment into a historical question, which is done with such a force, and that it is almost childish and naive. So, in another place, Gandhi is called by Ambedkar a child, an elf. He uses the language of myth. He's like an elf who is a kind of childish fictional character, because an elf moves with a kind of frictionless, smooth movement from anywhere to anywhere. Like a child's emotions can change before we can rationally pin a child down to a particular emotion. Ambedkar says Gandhi's philosophy is an elfish philosophy. Now, of course, this can simply be reduced to saying Gandhi is a hypocrite, which is probably something we can say with a lot of justification. But I don't want to reach any judgment like that, because whether true or not, it doesn't help us in our discussion. Because our discussion is far more fruitful if we keep looking very closely at the impasse, at the fracture, at the kind of tension that Gandhi's thinking produces for his interlocutor, which is Ambedkar in this case. So this is one part that I thought I should put to you as something which is a document or a kind of set of materials from which we can draw out certain general inferences about the thought of nonviolence. So the two inferences are what? First inference is that nonviolence expects the other to be violent insofar as the other is partisan, oppressed, and does not belong to the general order of objectivity. So in that sense, the empirical other, because all history is also full of empirical oppressed people. So a real person empirically is oppressed. A real group is empirically oppressed with a real name. So the question of name, which I don't want to go into, I've written about it, is so central to Ambedkar's own thinking, that what is a name and how do we make an empirical name into something which is a logic of conversion. We don't merely convert from one religion to another, but we convert from one name to another. But anyway, that's a separate discussion. So at that level, Gandhi is someone who says that non-violence is beyond partisan names. Non-violence is something which is a kind of higher principle, or if not a principle, a kind of higher speculation. Non-violence does not exist. Non-violence must come. Non-violence is to come. It does not exist. Because what exists are degrees of violence, only some of which are physical. So actually violence is a kind of gradation. It's a kind of continuum of degrees, only some of which are physical, but a lot of which might not be physical, but carries great force. And how to express force is something we're going to come to just in a few minutes with Simone Weil. But this is the first inference that we can draw from Gandhi's very casual, metaphorical statement with regard to Ambedkar, which is nonviolence expects violence from the other insofar as the other is a partisan, another is an empirical oppressed. The second inference is nonviolence only comes from greater objectivity, which the partisan, the empirical other, is deprived of precisely because of the nature of his or her experience, which is oppression. So this is the second inference. Nonviolence is higher or a higher, it possesses a higher value and depth, precisely because it does not come from experience as such. It has to come from somewhere else, some other faculty, or for some other perspective. So it is not in that sense historical. This is the point. It is not existential. It doesn't exist. It has no historical, because all existence has historical form. It must have complete, half complete, fuzzy, but every existence must go through some historical form, which is also changing, of course. But non-violence somehow for Gandhi does not have any kind of historical form as yet. That's the second inference, which is a difficult inference, I understand, because it's negative and speculative. But we have to kind of look at it very carefully. Because he is saying that precisely because you justifiably belong to a world of violence to which you are subjected, you are prevented from reaching that point of higher objectivity or higher necessity, which is the point from where non-violence can be prescribed or declared. So once you've said these two things, you have actually distinguished between two kinds of necessities. One is a necessity which comes from history, which itself is random, which itself by definition something contingent and changing. But if something, even if something is changing, but actually something, the very process of change is so slow, it's so excruciatingly painful that it seems as if it's eternal, like untouchability has over a long period of time. Gandhi agrees that kind of a sustained violence potentially carries a kind of volcano within it, a volcano of reaction. And this is what Ambedkar himself said, again and again on the question of reservation later, that we are agreeing to reservation because we are restraining ourselves. And he compares his people with Ireland, the Irish controversy over Catholics and Protestants. And he says in Ireland, there was a declaration of breaking that restraint, of abandoning that restraint. So the objective potential of violence is there in oppression, in caste discrimination. The objective potential is there, but that objective potential is held back. It's kind of restrained. And this is exactly what Gandhi is also saying. At that point, Gandhi and Ambedkar are actually saying the same thing, but from completely different points of view. Gandhi is saying this as a kind of naturalistic, unconscious situation of the oppressed, while Ambedkar is saying this as a conscious decision of the oppressed to hold back the path from the path of violence, which is neither to take the so-called higher decision of non-violence, nor to completely accept the violence of the situation and return it. And of course, there are tactical reasons why Ambedkar never clearly went for the path of violence, because a minority faced with majoritarian violence, even if it sporadically reacts with reactive and justified violence, cannot sustain it in a kind of civil war situation. But that does not mean methodologically there is not a civil war in caste society. So that's why Ambedkar very clearly said that in Annihilation of Caste at that time, that Indian society intrinsically, structurally contains a kind of silent civil war. But a silent civil war in which all parties are not equally allowed to bear arms. So the majority community, the caste Hindus, are allowed to bear arms, while the partisans of the civil war, the ones who are the objects of that war, which is the untouchable class and the Shudra caste also, are disabled. They are not allowed to bear arms. Now, bear arms is a statement of war, but it's not a statement of violence. It is in the sense of physical violence, a prescription of physical violence. It is to ask for the right of a capacity, not the right of a tactic which is violent. That is contingent. And Ambedkar, by and large, never openly takes the path of violence. That is true. But Ambedkar does hold very consciously, intellectually almost, theoretically, the capacity for resistance, whose degree of intensity will also have the violent threshold as a rightful claim, a right to that intensity, which he calls capacity to bear arms, which the uh, the excluded outcasts are prevented from having. So you see the difference here. Gandhi is saying that it is an unconscious kind of a justified, but unconscious, almost naturalistic, like animals who are weaker animals will at some point even, hopelessly fight back, kind of defensively fight back. It is hopeless. They can't fight a predator, but they will do it. So almost he's speaking in terms of a kind of naturalistic, reflexive reaction. But Ambedkar is saying the opposite. He's saying there is a conscious intellectual relationship to the capacity for resistance with a certain degree of violence that we have as a people, as a subject of politics. That is the point. That a subject of politics is not simply subjective. A subject of politics has a rationality, which Gandhi somewhere is preventing Ambedkar from enjoying, despite individually recognizing Ambedkar to be a supreme intellectual mind. So this is the second impasse from Gandhi's side. But you see, there's a third impasse, and I'll end with the third impasse. Then we can go to a discussion, which is the impasse of nonviolence itself. And in a sense, that brings us to the threshold of Gandhi's lifelong preoccupation with nonviolence, both as a strategy to achieve a certain aim in history, also as a principle, as a kind of higher necessity. So now, if we totally shift terrain and go to Europe, more or less in the same time, in the 1920s and 30s, and read a little bit of this fascinating and tortured figure, who I don't have the time to describe in terms of a biography, Simone Weil in France, who was a critic of Christian Catholicism while being deeply involved in the thinking of Christianity, and a great partisan of labor, rights of labor, and at the end, very, very movingly, and tragically, someone who subjected herself to such long periods of fasting and hunger that she actually died out of a kind of slow decline of the lack of nutrition in her body at a very young age. Why she did it, how she did it, is not something I'm going to talk about today, unless you want to discuss it in the discussion. But these are brief glimpses of a remarkable and tortured life. Now, Simone Weil, in her notebooks, refers to many things, among which also are the question of nonviolence. Also, a text from India. I mean, she, of course, refers to the most profound and profoundly difficult concept from Indian religious history, Hinduism, which is dharma. And she speaks of dharma in very aphoristic ways. And when I keep saying necessity, higher necessity, this is a word that Simone Weil uses. She says, necessity is something which we must obey. And in obeying necessity, we become free. So this is what is also her Spinozism, her deep study of Spinoza as a philosophy student in her young days. And she remains young, she dies young. And her teachers are Catholic Christians. There's a great theologian called Alain, her teacher. And she, in a sense, rebels against the Catholic idea of a kind of free individual with will. And will makes you do bad things, which comes from Augustine and so on and so forth. she really turns this whole discussion towards Spinoza. I don't want to go into that, but the point is that in Spinoza, freedom and necessity are not seen as opposites. It is a kind of deeper involvement with the very necessity of the process of nature and life that allows us to become free. It's a kind of higher consciousness of our own involvement with necessity. In a sense, it could also be called ecological. Because in ecology, we cannot afford to think of ourselves as anthropologically privileged and free and do anything that we want to, which we have, and damaged our own world so badly. But at the same time, we cannot afford to think ourselves as purely obedient and purely slavish. We have to think ourselves as thinking. So how can we think within nature and yet thinking is always at some level free? So there's very difficult but very attractive philosophical option of putting freedom and necessity on the same side rather than on two opposite sides is something which attracted Simone Weil throughout her work and life. And the language that she uses, which is a Spinoza's language, is the language of necessity. So there's a book which has come out again recently by very, very interesting Italian thinker called Roberto Esposito, who has written a book called Impolitical, Categories of the Impolitical, in which he has a chapter on Simone Weil. And much of what I'm saying has actually been brought out there. And much of that material from those notebooks has been used by Roberto Esposito. And Simone Weil correlates this language of Spinoza's necessity with the Hindu word dharma. And she says aphoristically, the dharma is necessity. But it's not necessity in the sense of slavery. It's necessity in the sense of something like sovereign necessity, free necessity. But what is that? How can we think about it in real historical and political terms? That will always remain the main question for us. Because otherwise, Simone Weil could just be another of those wonderful Orientalists attracted to certain images that she builds out of great Indian texts, which are problematical texts. And that question becomes even more serious and severe when we see that Simone Weil is also referring to a text both Ambedkar and Gandhi have referred to. So actually there is finally a fourth site of the debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar, which is a very textual site, which is the site of the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita. As we all know, Bhagavad Gita, Gandhi said was a mother. He used to speak of the text Gita as mother. It is not a text, it is my mother. In the way that mother solves all my problems, Gita solves my problems. That's how Gandhi, in a kind of very personalized way, would speak of the Gita. And of course, from the early period of his writing in Hind Swaraj and so on, would make many commentaries on the Gita. Ambedkar writes about Gita towards the last part of his life in such sharp analytical ways that it brings out a completely different textual, a kind of historical and textual criticism, with Gita not anymore something which is subjectivized and personalized and eternalized, but something which is a specific historical production of an ancient Indian society. And though there is no confrontation between the two of them directly as readers of the Gita, there is indirectly a big face-off or a big intellectual dispute between the two with regard to the Gita. And that could be now supplemented by this third figure, who is Simone Weil. And Simone Weil now speaks of the Bhagavad Gita, again to illustrate the question of necessity through the figure of Arjun in the famous moment when Arjun refuses to fight on the scene of the battle in Mahabharata. And Simone Weil says, Arjun's decision is wrong. Why is it wrong? And in a way, she joins that analysis or that evaluation of why Arjun's decision is wrong to be overwhelmed by pity, because that is what is said in the Gita, that Arjun is overwhelmed by pity when he sees all the familiar faces on the other side. Pity overwhelms him, and he says he will not fight. To which, of course, Krishna comes back with his arguments of the Gita. And from the other angle, of course, Krishna's own arguments are discussed for its own hypocrisy by Ambedkar in his text Krishna and his Gita, which I'm not going to go into right now. But what Simone Weil is saying is Arjun's decision is wrong because pity is something which does not belong to the order of the force that should make you decide. Pity is something which is too weak, too transient. It is too relative. It does not have necessity. But Krishna's arguments have necessity. And in a sense, insofar as Arjun was already guided by something which was a kind of training, a kind of studentship, apprenticeship under the law of necessity, he should have fought. And he shouldn't have decided not to fight. Though, of course, he changes his decision later. Because pity is not decisive, you see. This is the main point that Simone Weil is making, that necessity is decisive. Necessity leads to decision, and pity leads to doubt. Pity only leads to something flickering, something psychologically not persuasive. It just leads to negative moments that you don't know what to do, but you know that you don't want to do this or this or this. You keep flickering, you keep shifting ground, shuffling. While Simone Weil is saying that decision comes from necessity. And that necessity is, and she reads the Gita in a kind of heightened philosophical tenor from the side of Krishna, where she says that the main teaching of the Gita is necessity, insofar as necessity is pure. Necessity is the very action in its own acting. Necessity is the force of the action itself. This is the point. Necessity is the very acting of the action. Obviously, the reference is to action divorced from its result, phal, and all that. I don't want to go into the discussion of the shlokas. I'm not the best person to do it in any case. But very clearly, she's talking about the action and a philosophy of action which is immanent, which is a kind of self-referential in its intensity, rather than refer to something external, which is its end, its result, which might or might not be achieved. Because pity is only in reference to something which is a result. Oh, I will kill someone who I shouldn't kill, who is a relative, who is someone I know, who is a friend, and so on and so forth, according to Weil. While the actual action should be purely necessitarian in terms of its decisiveness. Now, this is the last moment of the impasse. That what is this decision then? How can we think of this decision? Well, otherwise, this decision is pure dogma. And that is what Ambedkar will say very clearly, very rationally. He'll say, oh, this is nothing but dogma. Krishna, on the one hand, says everything is relative. I have made the 4 varnas, the 4 estates. I have made the castes. So everything is relative. It is not actually anything inborn. It is only relative. It's only, just an arrangement of qualities, gunas. But at the same time, it is a caste law, which is Kshatriya Dharma, for Arjun to do what he's doing. So Ambedkar says this is hypocrisy, a logic of hypocrisy. On the one hand, you make things relative, everything is relative to everything else. And at the last moment of decisive, when you want the person to act in a certain way, you guide his decision not in terms of the existential force of the decision, but in terms of the pre-existent caste logic, which is purely mechanical and purely obligatory, purely heteronymous, and to that extent slavish, which is to simply follow caste law. So I follow my law as a Brahmin because I'm supposed to do it, not because existentially I actually feel the force of it, but I do it. So eventually it is of simply the return of the caste mechanism. And Ambedkar's analysis is that this is the double speak in Krishna. But Simone Weil doesn't say this. Simone Weil says that Arjun's decision not to fight is wrong because Arjun's decision has no force. While the whole idea of fighting as dharma, not in terms of caste dharma, but in terms of the dharma of the action itself. The action as itself, its own dharma, is pure necessity of the action. Now, if something is purely necessary, then its force must be contained in itself as something which is either, now how to think of this? You can easily think of this through aesthetics. You say, oh, it is like the action performed in a theater, in a dance, in a mime, when you actually don't mean to show the action in terms of its practical usage or utility, but you show it so really that people feel, oh, he's actually shooting an arrow, he's actually, throwing a punch, he's actually doing something which is damage to the other's body. But really, it is only performance. So performance, in that sense, has no real efficacy. Performance's efficacy is its own efficacy, which is an aesthetic efficacy. That would be one way. Simone Weil clearly says, no, that is not what I'm saying. It is not an aesthetic idea. It is not an aesthetic proposal. The actual question of action must be efficacy in itself. It must be done with its full intensity, its full accuracy, its full discipline, and yet it must be completely delinked from any kind of contingency of this result or that result, this historical end or that historical end. In that sense, it must be necessary. It must be necessary. So finally, in this context, we find Simone will pose a question for Gandhi. And this is what she says. And I'll end with that question and leave it for us to discuss the question itself. And Simone Weil says, and this is in the context of Gandhi's own conversation with a man who had come to almost fight Gandhi, to say that how can he not resort to violence when he has to protect his sister from marauders, from people who are going to attack her. So Simone Weil says that Gandhi's answer to such a person should be, or the test for Gandhi should be, that you can only prescribe non-violence to such a person that is an oppressed, in other words, an oppressed, a partisan of oppression, the family in Hathras, the people who are oppressed by the state in the different regions of our country, including the most, the most excluded ones on the borders, who have to face the might of both social exclusion and state violence. In each of these cases, if you prescribe non-violence to them, which Gandhi does, as we know, in specific moments and throughout his life, if you prescribe non-violence, then the real test is this. Does non-violence, and this is Simone Weil's word, does non-violence radiate the same force in that situation that force radiates in the muscles of the oppressed? Now, of course, Simone Weil does not say oppressed. She simply says the muscle of that person who Gandhi is talking to, who is feeling the violence inside him. But in general, if the muscles of the oppressed feel not the muscles of the oppressed are mobilized in violence or are committing violence, but they live the intensity of something, a force which can only be expressed in the image of violence, which Gandhi himself does, as we have seen. Then the question is, to someone like Gandhi or whoever who speaks of non-violence as a higher necessity, the question is, does non-violence radiate that same muscular intensity, that same intensity in the muscles? Depending on the answer, we can rightfully take up the thought and action of non-violence, or we can refuse to do so. Thank you. That is all I have to say today, and I'd be very happy to listen to you. And if you have anything to ask me, I'll be very happy to talk to you. I don't know how long I took, or Nabonil, আমি জানি না কতক্ষণ লাগলো, কিন্তু আমার যতটুকু বলার ছিল বললাম।
থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ স্যার। তো আমার কিছু বলার নেই দর্শকজন প্রেজেন্টেশনের পর। তো একটা প্রশ্ন সবে এসেছে, তো আমি যেটা প্রথমে বলে রাখি যে আপনারা প্রশ্ন করুন কমেন্ট সেকশন বক্সে, so you all can post your questions or comments if there are any. So the first question is by Jigisha Bhattacharya. She says, hello sir, if revolutionary violence is always to be considered revolutionary in retrospect, then how does one understand the importance of violence or non-violence in the moment? And the second question is, I'm also asking this in connection with the leftist traditions of thinking about the differential treatment towards organized and spontaneous forms of revolutionary violence. Is there any such way in which this has been dealt with Ambedkar?
So again, it's a big question. It needs a lot of elaboration. And thank you, Jigisha. Thank you for this. I'm very happy Jigisha is here to discuss this with me. Well, on the Ambedkar's own relationship to violence and revolutionary violence, a violence which is aimed to change a society or things fundamentally, I've already spoken about it, that there are two levels at which Ambedkar looks at violence. One is violence as something which in general can achieve something in a historically specific time frame, which so for instance, and this is connected to the first part of the question, this is what Lenin, for instance, was so deeply convinced about, that we must have violence as something purely as purely strategic in terms of two things. One is that it can only be a counter strategy to the larger legitimate violence of the state, which is the modern state is constituted by its apparatuses of legitimate violence, along with apparatuses of legitimate ideology, or ideology as the legitimization of everything else, but violence itself, police and so on and so forth. So the only way to build a counteroffensive against the structure of legitimate violence of a bourgeois state or a reactionary state is, in that sense, to also strategically mobilize the possibilities of a kind of organized revolutionary violence. Again, not in terms of action, but in terms of possibility. In terms of its no, I'm not finished. In terms of its stage by stage gradation. So the first stage is indeed to overthrow the state, which at a certain threshold could very well be a violent overthrow. But the second stage is actually to take over the various apparatuses of the state, the legitimate apparatuses of state violence. And that would be, and this is something we see in the period of the French Revolution terror as much, which is to take and the word terror, after all, comes from the state in every sense, in a positive and a negative sense. However much today we might speak of terrorism as something which is other than our legitimate states, no one can ever run away from the fact that organized, even desired terror is on the side of the state, even now, and in the period of what is called the reason of the state, the absolute state. So to take over that state becomes the second stage of proletariat's dictatorship in Lenin. Now, this is something Ambedkar actually discusses in his very, very brief but illuminating text, sparkling text called Buddha and Dhamma. Sorry, what am I saying? Buddha Marx, a lecture that he gave in Nepal. And there he says that, look, this question of proletariat dictatorship is all very well, but how are we so sure that the state will be totally proletarianized and not that the proletariat will become statified? And the history of state socialism has shown how the proletariat actually got statified and totally, in that sense, got taken over and colonized by a bureaucracy which again held on to its rights to violence, its legitimate rights to state violence, and went against the people and so on and so forth. But of course, in the very revolutionary transient period, it is always a very difficult question, because how does one, and this is a question I remember as a student, I had asked a well-known political scientist in JNU, that how does one ever evaluate a revolution, of an act of violence at its moment of emergence? How can one do that? Because it is only the efficacy of the violence with regard to not its own self, like Simone Weil wants, but its own unfolding, but in terms of something outside it. That is, does it take over the state? If it takes over the state, then that violence gets in a sense legitimized by, even revolutionary violence needs the legitimation of a revolutionary state. But revolutionary state in a long run seems to, and Marx himself said this, is a contradiction in terms. True revolution must end in the withering on the end of the state. So I mean, all of this Ambedkar is very well aware of, but in very, very concrete, specific terms, he never, like I said, prescribed any kind of revolutionary violence in a systematic way for any of the organizations that he was part of, and he in a sense also initiated, for a clear reason, that in Indian society, with the kind of lack of balance of sheer strength of forces, a minority like the minority of the untouchable classes and the Shudra castes would either be appropriated into the logic of violence, which is the legitimate violence of upper castes in society, or they would be completely at the end destroyed by the sheer brutality of upper caste violence. And this is something we have actually seen unfold over time. The political rise of the OBC and Shudra movement, in a sense, has also divided and redistributed the possibility of legitimate violence in society a little bit. But in terms of society as such, and not society and the state in its kind of very, very unstable alliance with each other, but in terms of state, family, the upper caste violence is so dominant and so overwhelming that all minorities, including religious minorities, are at a very, very disastrous kind of disadvantage. Now, of course, that does not mean, like Gandhi himself accepted that this is not going to lead to pure subjugation or even co-option. No, the upper castes and the state might always say that, look, we have such violence, you can't fight us. Does not mean everyone is going to say, okay, we are going to join you. There'll always be the reflex of rebellion, of a kind of counter-violence. It'll always be there. It'll always be there. But the point is, should this counter-violence, or can this counter-violence be mobilized strategically as revolutionary in the kind of legitimate sense, or in the sense that Lenin wanted, which is targeted towards taking over of the state? Ambedkar did not take that path at all. He did not take that path at all. And then, of course, towards the end of his life, he had a philosophical and a total justification of it in terms of Buddhism, which I haven't spoken about at all today. But that is something also it's essential to enter that discussion. So yes, that would be the response.
Okay, so thank you, sir. And the next question is by Harshvardhan Sumant. Harshvardhan says, thank you, sir, for this wonderful, elaborate reading of fragments of Gandhi and Ambedkar debate. And his question is whether we can understand necessity without the obligation of natural or survival-oriented thinking, or rather modern categories of money, safety, etc. If yes, just pardon me. Yes. If yes, then how? And on the other hand, how does the axiomatic thinking gather that force in its process?
So that is exactly the concern of people like Simone Weil, particularly, when they want to follow a kind of thread of intensity. They neither take the rational, conscious subject as something pre-given, nor do they accept the total reign of natural necessity, which is always something something outside oneself, something to which one is subject to as like an object, of that necessity. Whether you think of it through through very specific cause and effect that takes place in life processes, biological processes, like we are facing now with the coronavirus situation. It is a kind of natural necessity we are subject to today. We are objects of natural necessity. So either we do what most people are doing now, which is to say that, oh, let us subject ourselves to this necessity and kind of use this necessity to change ourselves for some kind of a better future, or at least more secure future. Now, this is a very strange kind of convoluted thinking, and that is what is also called opportunity, to make the crisis an opportunity. But this is logically untenable, because if the crisis is born from a necessity outside of us, over which by definition we do not have control, then how can we make it an opportunity? Because opportunity by definition requires at least a degree of conscious freedom, some degree of calculability, some level of using an opportunity to create something out of our will, But we start with the premise that we are in a situation of natural necessity. So you're right, Harshvardhan, that this kind of natural necessity is precisely something which can only be rooted and collapse back into some sort of a heteronomous, some sort of a passive acceptance of a process which we can only imagine or put in terms of images. So that's why Gandhi keeps using the images of, oh, he can hit us. Why would Ambedkar? I mean, just think of it. What a strange and almost ridiculous thing to say. He can. Why would Ambedkar spit on anybody? Why would he do that? What makes you think Ambedkar wants to spit? I mean, why use that really ignominious, horrible metaphor? Because you see, what Gandhi is doing is something really strange, but at the same time very effective. He's posing the worst for Ambedkar, and at the worst, he wants Ambedkar justified at that level. So he will say, look, I'm with the oppressed, even if the oppressed do the worst. Yeah. So if the oppressed go ahead and do something really horrible, because they're the oppressed, I say that, I'm with them. But at the same time, I will not give them rationality. I'll not give them the consciousness of a decision. So the second part of your question becomes very important. The consciousness cannot be simply something which comes out of a set of natural, like, Kant, the Western philosopher, in a sense, the pioneer of modern Western philosophy, said that natural necessity poses a limit. We cannot cross that limit. If we cross that limit, we enter into delusion. It isn't something, you can only have regulative horizons. We cannot actually reach something beyond nature, beyond what nature imposes on us as conditions of experience, and that holds at some level. So the other way of thinking about it is axiomatic, something which consciousness does not master. So natural necessity cannot be mastered in any delusional sense, nor does it submit to natural necessity as something which is purely heteronomous, as a kind of god of nature, but something which consciousness can actually show courage with. So politics, for instance, cannot be shown through nature in this thinking, but politics can be speculatively or axiomatically proposed as based on the courage of ideas. The idea of equality, Ambedkar said, this cannot be really seen in nature, unless you use metaphors, which can be loose metaphors. You cannot really prove equality, and that is what counter-revolutionary, inegalitarian, violent ideologies have always taken the help of, reaching up to racism and every kind of supremacist thinking, which is that in nature there is hierarchy. Now, whether that is true or not is not the point. Point is, this is an unresolved problem. So if you want to posit equality and even freedom, because freedom absolutely cannot be absolute, that is obvious. that they can only be done through the courage of something like consciousness or reason, whichever word you want to use. You cannot hope to have consciousness master it, because the moment you master it, you actually become an agent of crushing others' freedom. But the thinkers I have spoken of today, particularly Simone Weil, Ambedkar would be someone who I think would follow the path of axiomatic courage. But Simone Weil wants to take the path of some kind of a spiritual materialism, or a kind of material spirituality, which is the spirituality of intensity. One manifestation of which could also be violence. So yes.
Okay, sir. Next question is by Vaibhav Abhinave. He says, thank you so much, sir, for this fascinating lecture. His question is, can we say that nonviolence it truly radiates itself as force? It can do so only as partisan and subjective thought force.
So yes, I mean, at the moment, nonviolence is taken as a path, like Gandhi, takes the path of making nonviolence into an actual act of putting the body at some kind of deprivation, like hunger, and making that hunger into a kind of performance or a spectacle or a point of attention for the target audience, both in terms of making people come with him in solidarity, but also making the British authorities, or Ambedkar in this case, to be persuaded to give up their demands, or to accept Gandhi's demands as a political tactic. Now, all of this means that nonviolence does enter the body. Nonviolence is played through the physiology of the nonviolent subject, so to speak, the nonviolent partisan actor, so to speak. And Gandhi is actually someone who is an exceptional figure of this kind of manifestation of force. But Simone Weil is saying something somewhat different. Gandhi's force is still, and this is something which has been pointed out by several thinkers, from D.R. Nagaraj to Arundhati Roy. Aishwarya Kumar has written about many of these things with great sophistication, and many others, that for good reasons or suspicious reasons, Gandhi's actions do have an addressee outside it. Gandhi's actions do have a force, a very, very powerful force, but in the sense of a spectacular force. Now, that is not to say Gandhi is not real. On the contrary, there's no one more real than Gandhi in that period of time. But that real is also not the real is not let free as something unstructured, unformed. So Gandhi is also a formalizer, to the point that it's very difficult to know which part is formally deployed as a strategy and which part is absolutely lived as spontaneous, historical experience. So when he says that I am a Bhangi, I am an untouchable, is it that he experiences the life of an untouchable, which is structurally impossible? But then if you say it's completely theatrical, it's completely, for the heck of saying it, now that might well be true at some level, but the fact is that in saying it, he does have an efficacy. He does manage to make a lot of people at that time, not maybe now anymore, but a lot of people at that time in the national movement hear him and feel the efficacy of his statement, which is a performance statement, a performative statement. So there is something going on which reaches the kind of the force of the body, but it does not still satisfy the criterion of Simone Weil, which is that the force should be something which should be impersonal. The force is not a calculated force. The force is a radiation. See, this is the key word. The force is a radiation. I'm not sure that attribute of radiating applies to Gandhi in the way at least Simone Weil demanded this attribute. Of course, this is up for historical and other kinds of evaluations. So yeah.
Okay, sir. The next question is by Kushumita Datta. She says that, does the hunger strike make a martyr of Gandhi? Uh, and is this martyrdom, is this martyrdom comparable to the martyrdom of Bobby Sands?
Sorry, martyrdom of, I didn't follow the martyrdom
Yeah.
who? Compared to the martyrdom?
Does the hunger strike make a martyr of Gandhi? And
That
second
bit I
part
got.
is the martyrdom comparable to the martyrdom of Bobby Sands?
Oh, Bobby Sands. Oh, right,
Right.
Bobby. Okay. So martyrdom. So yes, that is a very important question, a central question of putting your body at real risk of death, to the point that it can actually expire, and in that sense becomes the ground or the site of something else, something new, or something consolidated. Something. So the body of the hunger striker reaching to the point of death becomes a kind of passage, and martyrdom is a kind of passage, no doubt. Not in the sense of the anthropological rites of passage, which, again, to come back to the example of what happened in Hathras, when the state very cold-bloodedly and systematically deprived the woman her rights to, not a religious right. I mean, people are wrong to highlight the religious right. It is an anthropological right. She was denied her anthropological rights. It doesn't matter whether it's Hindu or Muslim, or even something which is so-called non-religious, but a right to which the family is not the agent of the rite of passage, is an anthropological deprivation. So in that sense, she's been excluded from civilization, as it were, at the moment when she actually is a target of civilization's greatest caste violence. So in that sense, it is also an exclusion from the possibility of martyrdom. You see, so maybe what the state really feared was martyrdom, because if you're within civilization, then any kind of violence or even hunger strike which reaches up to the point of death can be transformed into martyrdom. But the moment it is excluded from that sphere of civilization or society, martyrdom is prevented, because martyrdom can lead to inspiration. Like Bobby Sands is also an example like that. It can lead to a tremendous amount of consolidation of like liberation theology, or even communism, which has its great list of martyrs, its history of martyrs, and other kinds of martyrdoms, which led to great insurrections. So maybe what happened in Hathras was to prevent such, not an insurrection, but such an imagination of an insurrection, which even a simple rite of passage could just trigger. So maybe that was what was at stake, which is at an anthropological level, at a general level. But then, if the specific question of martyrdom is raised with regard to someone like Gandhi, now, of course, Gandhi, again, was someone who likened himself to Christ, and to that extent, almost a kind of, it was a kind of imitatio Christi, imitation of Christ's martyrological, life and self. But at the same time, Gandhi was someone who again, like he made his relationship with Gita totally personalized. His relationship to Christ was also personalized. So it has nothing to do with Christianity or religion or anything like that. It has something to do with he used again a very beautiful metaphor. It has something to do with the fragrance that I can feel from the life of Christ, not the so-called the great truth of the gospel, but the fragrance of the story, the fragrance of the life. And if you make things personalized and subjective, then of course martyrdom becomes